in a series and we're talking about, we're exploring this idea of God giving us eyes to see. And it's not just the physical eyes, like we know this. There are metaphors in the scripture, the eyes of our heart, that we don't have literal eyes in our heart. So what is he talking about? And we've been looking at this parable that Jesus told. Particularly, he told a string of them, but the first one he told in Matthew chapter 13. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. And as he tells this parable, you remember this, it was the four soils. You remember this from the last couple weeks ago? Yes, remember? Maybe. First soil, throws it, lands on the road. Second one, he throws it, lands in the rocky soil. The third one he throws, it lands in the thorny soil. And the first one, the birds come and eat it. The second one, the sun scorches it. And the third, the thorns grow up and choke it out. And the fourth, though, falls in good soil and boom, explodes a beautiful crop. And so that's the parable. And the disciples come to him and said, why do you talk to us in parables? And he says, because I want to nudge you. I want you to see things differently than you normally see things. I want you to learn to see things differently. We talked about this, and the way we set this up is he's kind of using these big ideas and then these corresponding disciplines or practices. And the first one was the fact that we wanted people to pay attention. I'm inviting you, and we're learning together how to pay attention. And this is the practice of being able to notice things, to be able to notice things. I don't know if you know this or not, but your brain is a weird thing. Did you know this? Nobody? So this is true. We have things in our brains, in our minds, that we have no idea is there, and it shapes and affects all sorts of things we're unaware of. I remember a few years ago, I was making my Spotify playlist. I have three playlists. One is a worship playlist, which I use a lot. But the two ones that are my go-tos are, one is my 80s favorites, and it's Depeche Mode, Pet Shop Boys, Tears for Fears, Little Van Halen, right? It's just on and on. And then I have another playlist called Cool Current Songs. This is like Coldplay, Imagine Dragons, John Mayer. Anybody who's not 80s goes in Cool Current Songs, okay? It doesn't matter where they are. And so a few years ago, I was probably 52. So I know it's about 30 years later, because I did the math. But I saw a song that came up on one of my things. It was by a band called Chick-fil-A. You remember Chick-fil-A? Two of y'all remember Chick-fil-A. I heard this song, I am not making this up, in the 6th grade. I was probably 11, maybe 12 years old. The song came on, and I was like, ever since she left me, I sure feel all alone. A little misunderstanding, can't get her on the telephone, hanging downtown on Main Street, living in a different world, standing around with a gang on the corner, talking about my girl. Gone. She's been gone so long. She's been gone so long. Every word to that song came back to me. I had not heard that song in 30 years. It was there. What kind of stuff is in your brain that you have no idea is there? And more importantly, how does it shape the way in which you see the world, the things you think about the world? We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week. This is why the call in the scriptures is so profound, and it is interesting that we are starting to see so much emphasis on this in modern psychology and other places, but it's the transformational aspect of our thinking, of our minds. And it's to notice things. And part of this exercise isn't simply to notice. You can't just notice and observe, but you got to drive it down to something that you believe in and trust and can build your life upon. And so we talked about to pursue truth. You have to pursue truth. This is ultimately what you trust. And this is about defining things. This is about you and I understanding what it is, like putting words to things. We're going to talk a little bit more about this next week again. And then today, I want to talk about seeking understanding. Do you understand things? Do you understand? And the idea isn't just information or knowledge, but it's about how the things that we believe and know are integrated into our lives. The word for understand, a lot of times, most translations in the Greek is this idea of synesis, or where we get our word synergy or synthesis or those kinds of things. And it's an integration of things. It's how things get implemented or integrated into our lives. When I talk about wisdom, and when I think about the way we are to be as human beings, the idea I often use is integration. Because integration is what whole people do. It's how whole people operate. The problem with integrity is not that you didn't do what you say. The problem with lacking integrity is that you are disintegrated. There are parts and crevices and creeks that operate in different ways in different times. There's no wholeness, there's no unity. So the call of wisdom throughout the scriptures is to integrate these things into a whole life from which we live. I'm gonna try to explain this very clearly by the end of our time today. So you can tune out for the next little bit. Just come back when I start talking about Chick-fil-A, okay? That's the only rule. So I did if you remember, so we looked at this. Week 1, I read this quote to you from Jamie Smith. It's out of his book. It's Imagination of the Kingdom. And he says this, that much of our action, and part of what I want you to do is as we read books, or as I read books, I want to inflict them on you in particular ways. But I want to kind of let you know what we're looking for and what we're noticing and what we're seeing. And you're not going to remember it because you came to church one time. It's going to take thought and kind of wrestling through and trying to understand some things. Much of our action, he writes, is not the fruit of conscious deliberation. Instead, much of what we do grows out of our passional orientation of the world. Like how we just have inherited or see things, affected by all the ways that we've been primed to perceive the world. In short, our action emerges from how we imagine the world, our capacity to see things. That's largely what defines how we move and interact with things. And that shaping of our character is to a great extent the effect of the stories that have captivated us, that have sunk into our bones. That there's the narratives, the stories, the things that we tell ourselves that have captivated our hearts and they have formed our imaginations. And this is why I think, I mentioned this is why the gospel and preaching the gospel to yourself and immersing yourself in the story of God and the way of his son Jesus is so critical. It has to captivate us and form our imagination, how we're going to see the potential and the hope for the world that we live in. That's what we've got to be able to do. Again, not to keep piling on, but I want you to see this. There's a psychiatrist named Kirk Thompson. He's gotten very popular. He's written about shame and desire, and he writes this. He's talking about the mind. This is where I started thinking about Chilliwack. And this is the quote that I read. Attention is the engine of the mind's train that pulls along all the rest of the functional cars. Ultimately, we become what we pay attention to. Do you know why we're scattered and anxious and and disintegrated all the time? We live, and this is a phrase from Jonathan Haidt from about 10 years ago. He said that with the advent of the phones and devices and the internet to the world at our fingertips, we live in a state of continuous, partial attention. We become what we pay attention to, and the options available to us at any point in time are myriad. They're many. And the most important of which are being located within us. It's these things that keep recurring, that frame us. So that's how I want for us to look at this as we take a peek at back into this parable. Matthew chapter 13, and so Jesus tells the story of these 4 soils. They go, why do you tell us stories? He quotes from Isaiah that there are people who are seeing, but they don't see. They are hearing, but they don't hear. They perceive, or they perceive things, but they don't understand them. And what he's beckoning us to do is to understand things. And you have to seek this. You have to pursue these things. This is work. And so then he explains what the parable of the sower means. And here's how he does it. Matthew chapter 13, verses 18 and 19. Listen then what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their hearts. This is the seed that was sown along the path. 2 things I want to notice. What is the message? It is a message about the kingdom. Hopefully, if you've been coming to Port City very long, you are sick of me saying this. Because if you're sick of me saying this, that means I'm almost beginning to say it enough for us to really get this through the way most of us have grown up looking and seeing the gospel. It is a message about a rule and a reign and a governance and an authority, a system. And this is why I often say when it comes to politics and these things, you've heard me say this a gajillion times, the left and the right, the political left and the political right are both, you want to complete the sentence with me? Two sides of the same coin in the wrong system for those of us who follow Jesus. It's a message about a kingdom. Whenever someone does not understand this, it gets uprooted. Whenever this doesn't get synthesized, integrated into your human experience, our human experience, it doesn't take root and it doesn't hold and it becomes chaff and it's blown away, it becomes something else. That's the seed sown along the path. Next section, the seed falling on the rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word, and this is again the same thing. It's here's the message of the kingdom, and they receive it with joy. We talked this last week. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. And when trouble and persecution comes because of this, they fall away quickly. And we're going to make just a quick note here that there are two things that are listed here. It's trouble and it's persecution. And persecution is not that someone made a comment about you on social media. That's not persecution, right? I know we have this whole thing about it's a whole other message, but you get that. He's talking about when we are faced with the opposition that comes from the contrast of the way of the kingdom and the way of the world. It's that thing. Then thirdly, or the next section, he says, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone, again, who hears the word, who hears this message, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth, they choke this message. They keep it from getting traction, and they make it what? You said it out loud. Unfruitful. But the seed falling on the good soil refers to someone who hears the crop and understands it, and this is the one who produces a crop yielding 160, 30 times what was sown. And it's all about, here it is again, the seed that falls on the good soil. So good soil refers to what? Someone who understands. We'll just make this so it's really clear. Can we see this? Perfect. One of my habits I'm learning this year is to pray the Psalms. And I heard this great sense of advice in praying the Psalms is a lot of times when you're praying the Psalms, you'll go find a psalm that matches your emotion. Like if you're feeling a little angsty, you go find an angsty psalm, and there's some angsty psalms. There's psalms that pray for the people who've said bad things about you to be destroyed. That is a fun psalm when you're a little angsty and a little chipper, right? There are psalms that match the despair. There are songs that match being beat up by sin and shame. There are psalms that declare God's beauty and glory. They're all throughout there, and they're scattered throughout. And I've been reading them in order because the advice was, if you're only looking for the psalm to match your emotion, you're likely to find one. And what he said I found is that angry people pray angry prayers. And greedy people pray greedy prayers, and but if you just read them in order, you just get what's in front of you, and you have to sort of bring your emotion into what's that, and let those two things work together. That's the transformative part. And so I was reading this, and I was in Psalm 32 a few weeks ago, and I came across this, and I just marked it down in my journal, and now I think I know why. Psalm chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, it says this, I will instruct you and teach you the way that you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. And then he says this, do not be like the horse or the mule. So we have a metaphor. Don't be like the horse or a mule, which have no understanding. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be talking about this in a few weeks. I'll mark this down. And look at the way it's acknowledged that someone without understanding has to be controlled by a bit or a bridle, or they're not going to do what they're supposed to do. So if you, it's like if your wife has to tell you over and over again that this makes her mad, right? It's the bit or a bridle. You only do things because she says or he says. You can switch this around if you want. Or it's that you have to be told what to do or you ain't gonna do it. You know, it's like Lennon. You have to remind Lennon every time she goes into preschool. It's like, say hey to your friends and don't take stuff. She's 2, don't take stuff, right? You have to put the bit in the bridle. Don't take stuff that's not yours. You gotta say hey to people and you can't just say no to everybody. You gotta do this. And what you're doing is you're training them, but eventually guess what will happen? She won't need that anymore because she'll become the kind of person that says hello to her friends and doesn't take stuff all the time. It's gonna happen. It's hard to believe sometimes, but it's gonna happen. For those of you who are parents, right, you know this. It's going to happen. And so it's this idea that how do we become the kind of person for whom these things aren't thing? And the whole thing is to seek understanding. And here's the tension for us. To seek understanding, and it's present tense. You don't seek understanding, then you get it, and then you go and you apply it for the rest of your life. To seek understanding is a continual posture that we need, and it's the posture for this. It's a posture from which we learn to trust the foundation of truth that is Jesus and his rule and his message. In fact, I'll just put this up there for us. Here's what I mean. I mean, it is Jesus, it is his rule. That's not a good R. My hand's like shaky, too much coffee this morning. And that is his message. It's these things. This is what we're building on. And what a lot of us have learned, myself included, is that we have learned how to separate the implications of the gospel in some compartment that's religious and our walks and our faith, and then the real world in which we live. So for example, we've all learned, we know that things like turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, love your enemies. We've heard these, right? Jesus said them. It's funny, I had this, I don't have time to get into that. Stay focused. Go the extra mile, love your enemies. Values of meekness, of humility, of gentleness, of love. These are all things that we would say yes and amen to, right? Most of us. And then simultaneously, we know how the world works, and we know that these things are not always valued in the world in which we live. And if we're really honest, we know that they actually won't work in the world in which we live. You know that, right? No? You know that if you give someone an inch, if you defer to someone who you're in competition with, what are they gonna do? They're gonna use it against you and take you, right, give them an inch, they're gonna take a mile. And somehow we compartmentalize and say, we don't need to go that extra mile with them and we have all these reasons. And this is what has happened to us. We have learned these things, and so now we have a different way of pursuing or understanding this. And I'll just give you, this is just sort of my own red flags. Red flags wave whenever I hear people, I don't care if they're pastors or politicians or anybody else, who uses scripture or Jesus to belittle or to berate or to divide or to hold contempt for another person. And they use rhetoric to call people to arms, to create an enemy out of fear and suspicion. These things are absolutely inconsistent with the way of Jesus. They're absolutely, And the same way when people trot him out as a mascot to say, well, love means anything goes, neither of these are consistent with the way of Jesus. In fact, they are both gross misrepresentations of it. You should always rave a red flag when you hear those things. I hear this, I see feeds all the time talking about Christians. You can no longer be nice because the future has to be fought for. I heard a guy say a couple weeks ago, he said, Jesus warned us that we're gonna be maligned and persecuted and hated. And I thought, how can you misquote this so badly? Because what it says is, blessed are you when people say all kinds of false things about you, and blessed are you when these things happen to you. That is hard to reconcile in our lives. So what do we do? We're used to using these things to draw battle lines. And so what my journey was like is I had to ask myself, how serious is Jesus about these things? And that's the question. How serious was he when he said, love your enemies? How serious was he when he says, the meek shall inherit the earth? And I'll tell you, I don't like it. There was a guy I went to seminary with, and he had a t-shirt, and it was a t-shirt, if you remember Charles Barkley back in the day, right? The rebounding machine. And he had a shirt, had Charles Barkley with his hands on the balls, like a cartoon character, and it said, the meek shall inherit the earth, but they won't get the ball. And it's like, how serious is Jesus about these things? How serious is he that these things be embodied in those who follow him and who gather to represent his life in his way? And this is about understanding. And I'll tell you, it is way easier to just settle in and think of the world that way than it is to try to dig in and understand. Here's what I've learned, that this way of understanding goes beyond some things. To live in truth, to walk, to embrace, to absorb this. And rather than working to live in the truth, what we often do is we mine it, we factualize it, we compartmentalize it, we sort of systematize it, and then we use it as evidence to defend positions or to further our views. And in doing so, I think we miss being drawn into another way of life. And this is what I'm after. How are you and I drawn, pulled into a way of life that is fundamentally different? And this is hard. This is not easy, and this is not gonna be solved in a message, but we're all gonna have to work together to this. And so what I mean, and here's the reality, and I talk to people a lot of times, and this is what I've learned, that we are working, let me back up. That if you and I'll just say me, if a person is not bearing fruit that is consistent with who God is and the love that he extends, they don't understand. You don't understand. And so the mode is, it's not that it's that understanding is beyond these places. And this is what I noticed from this passage. The seed that fell on the rocky ground, right? When trouble and persecution come, they wither and go away because there's no roots. When we get pulled in and the worries of this life sort of overwhelm us, it just chokes out anything that we hoped or believed. And the deceptiveness of wealth, right, sort of pulls us into places of complacency or not worrying about the things that perhaps, or being concerned about the things that perhaps we should be. And so I made a list that this way of understanding, and here's what I mean by understanding, that we are working to understand how our way of life, you and I, is integrated into the way of Jesus rather than how Jesus is integrated into our way of life. Does that make sense? A lot of us have gotten good at getting Jesus to do things the way we integrate him into what we're already doing. But what he's asking us to do, we've been transferred from one kingdom into the other. And so as we learn this, it pushes us towards something. And I think this parable is actually not just 4 random seeds, but it actually works like a progression. I'm very grateful. Rick Schaefer, one of our pastors here, he wrote a little book called Taking a Zero that explains this extremely well. But it's this idea that it's actually sort of a progression, that once a seed is planted, it has to sink in, it has to settle, and then a lot of things happen underneath the surface. It begins to take root, and it begins to confront a lot of the things that we believe or think, and then it begins to define our lives rather than simply complementing them. And so the list goes like this. It's beyond disruption. It's beyond inconvenience. It's beyond discomfort. It's beyond pain. This message, this way has to get beyond all the things that are going to come against you and me as we start to walk and try to live in this way. Things are going to rub against you and push on things that you have long thought. It's going to push. Sometimes there's going to be pain and anxiety and things that will happen that will make you say, how can God be like this? And you have to push through those things in order to find this. It has to move beyond anxiety and fear and wondering whether or not this way of life will actually work for you or for me or for us, the worries of this life. We have to learn how to navigate and to trust, and it's in those places that we are formed and our roots grow deeper and they become able to withstand the stuff that's happening on the surface. This is the metaphor, this is the picture of this seed, and the seed actually has to hold beyond comfort. Has to hold beyond comfort. There's something about being changed enough. And this is what a lot of people do. They come into the church like, oh man, I need to be changed because my marriage is this. And you get changed just enough to not be annoying anymore. And you're like, whew, that's enough. Now God can leave me alone. And he doesn't. He doesn't. And then he starts messing with stuff that you thought was firmly in your control. We got to get beyond the comfort. That we're now satisfied, we're now comfortable with what God has done, and he continues to move us into places. There's something to be said about having enough money or resource to make your own way in this world, to call the shots and to make things happen. And it is easy to stop there because honestly, it's the best way to live, isn't it? But you can be unfruitful, and that's the point. The point is in our comfort. The point is in our control. The point is fruitfulness. How are we going to bear fruit? We talked this last week. Our vision for that is important. And so the challenge of all this is understanding that it lies beyond. And the language of the scriptures, it's interesting, is always that we would not stop short. I can tell you so many stories in my life where I got to a point where I thought, okay, now if we can just keep it this way, then we'll be fine. And you feel like God is moving us forward. And every one of those places, I look back now and say, I cannot believe that I almost missed it because I was willing to stop short. I was willing not to trust or not to move or any of those things. And so what you have to understand is that understanding is beyond informative to being formative, to changing and shaping us. And so when I say integration, I do not mean simply how Jesus and God and the Bible fit into your life. I mean how you and I are becoming the kind of people who integrate more fully into the way of God's rule and his love and the kingdom of the Son whom he loves, how we integrate into his life. And so I was like, how do I explain this? I thought, here's a way. So hopefully this will help. Chick-fil-A. So now you can all tune back in if you weren't paying attention for a while. If you go to Chick-fil-A and they give you your food and you say, may I have some Chick-fil-A sauce? And they hand you Chick-fil-A sauce and you say, thank you. What do they say? They say, my pleasure. Every single time. In fact, sometimes I'm like, can I get some napkins? Yes, thank you, my pleasure. Can I get some, okay, I know it's your pleasure. Let's do all this at one time so I don't have to hear my pleasure 30 times, right? You've heard this, we've been there. I did some research. I think this started somewhere around 2001 or 2000, somewhere that the stories vary. but evidently it was an edict from Truett Cathy about customer service. And I worked at Chick-fil-A for 6.5 years. You're drilled in the customer service. The customers are valued and you serve them well. And so it was driven out of that mindset. And the best way for that to happen was for employees of Chick-fil-A, for it to be their utter delight to refill your sweet tea. And so it's a genius idea. You make an edict and you say, every time someone says thank you, you have to say my pleasure. This does two things. Number one, if you're an employee, you either have to lie or you have to become a particular way. Do you see this? This is so good because for a long time, this is a bridle in the horse's mouth. I don't care what happens, just say my pleasure. But we always say you're welcome. I don't care, say my pleasure. It's the bridle in the horse's mouth. Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you, my pleasure. Refill your drink, my pleasure. Here's your Chick-fil-A sauce, my pleasure. Honey mustard or whatever you like. Here's your nuggets. Thank you, my pleasure. Like it just becomes. And here's the thing. A person can understand this. And they can understand it at the level that just says, as an employee, if someone says, thank you, I just say, my pleasure. And you can become hardened and mechanical because you're sick of it. Or you can become fake and manipulative because you learn how to go, my pleasure. And nothing remain unchanged in your heart. And there's lots of other places you can live and not have to say my pleasure. In fact, some restaurants, you don't have to say anything. I've been to them, right? Thank you. Perfect. I'll get it myself. But if you have been transferred into the kingdom of the chicken, there is a rule or a way. And though Truett Cathy is no longer here, what do you think his desire is for those who bear the image of the chicken man? It is to be the kind of people for whom it is their pleasure to serve you Chick-fil-A nuggets. Understanding is not just, I know I'm supposed to say my pleasure. Understanding is for that to be, for you to be integrated into that way and to become the kind of person. Does this make sense? Do you see where we're going? So for you and I to be fruitful, to bear fruit for God's kingdom, it's to be transferred into this way and under this rule and to become the kind of person from whom these things flow. So here's the question that I want to leave you with. How might the kingdom of God, like your imagination of God's kingdom, affect the way you see the world and your way of operating within it? To learn humility and meekness and vulnerability and others-oriented, self-sacrificing love. To learn these things is going to take a bridle in the horse's mouth for a while. But you live there long enough and you'll become the kind of person for whom these things are normal. But you have to be able to imagine what the world could be like if it was confronted and exposed to this over and over and over and over and over and over again. Through discomfort, through, oh my gosh, is this gonna work? How's this gonna turn out? Through the anxious parts, the worries, the pain, the grief, the struggle beyond those things, for it to become, to take root and to grow. I try to imagine, Lord, what would it be like? And it's not mine, it's our if our soil were to bear this kind of fruit at 30, 60, 100-fold. Seek understanding. The discipline is, how are you being integrated into this way of life? And you got to have a vision, an imagination for the kind of hope and beauty that God intends for his world. And then you and I begin to live into that. I want you to bow your head and close your eyes, and I want you to just think about your own view of God's kingdom. Is it golden pillars and gates in St. Peter? Or is it a place where this humanity, the sea of humanity, there's no more tears and no more sorrow and no more division, but that every tribe and tongue and nation are unified in bringing this beauty of God's love into the way humans relate to one another and dwell with one another and contribute for one another and make something in the world. Like, can we get a vision for that and then allow it to shape our view in our work within this world? Father, would you reveal to us more and more and more of your message of the kingdom? And that message would take root in our lives and not be choked out by all the things that threaten it. That we would use, you would use us in one another's lives to help us to stay in and not stop short, to move beyond these things, to find fruitfulness that you have intended us for. And I ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.